Lights, camera, innovation. Walt Disney Studios chose advanced 5G solutions from T-Mobile for Business to transform the movie-making process. Together, we kept a remote production hub in Hawaii and sync with a team in California to bring Lilo and Stitch to theaters this summer. This is picture-perfect collaboration. This is Walt Disney Studios with T-Mobile for Business. Take your business further at T-Mobile.com/now.
America's beverage companies are investing in America. We're American companies, making American products with American workers in America's hometowns. We're local bottlers and manufacturers, operating in all 50 states, employing more than 275,000 Americans in good-paying jobs, delivering for the nation, because we believe in the promise of America and the people who make it great. Learn more at WeDeliverForAmerica.org. Paid for by the American Beverage Association.
This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the New York State Republican Party and County Chair of the Suffolk Republican Party. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Eric Levine is in transit. Hopefully he'll be phoning in to join us. And we're honored and privileged today to have a very special guest, Peter Rough, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, a world-renowned think tank. He's an expert on national security and defense and foreign policy. He led the office, or was the Associate Director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives with President Bush. Additionally, he helped President Bush with the well-regarded memoir, Decision Points. Mr. Rough, we're honestly delighted to have somebody of your expertise joining us on today's Let the Record Show. Thank you for being here.
The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me, guys.
So, let me start off with my thesis, and then I want your comments. I want the focus to be on Russia-Ukraine or Ukraine-Russia. I have the view that it's time for Trump to take no for an answer, that Trump's administration has to really rethink what it's doing, and it has to move quickly and decisively. There are too many threats out there and too little effective responses. It's nice to negotiate. It's nice to have diplomatic conversations. But when the other guys are using that to play you, to stretch out the clock and keep doing harm, it's time to do something about it. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, this war was started by Russia, not by Ukraine. This war has decimated the country of Ukraine, yet they fight back. And just recently, they had successful attacks by taking out about 40 of the planes that were important carriers for the Russian military effort against the Ukrainian people, as well as disabling that bridge, which is a connector between Crimea and Russia. And Putin and his foreign minister and his mouthpieces and his former president, whose name Medvedev, I guess it is, saying this was an act of terrorism, this is awful, they've just raised the stakes. Now, what would you have Ukraine do? What should the United States do? And where are we? Mr. Rough, we're all ears.
Well, thanks. It takes me back to, I think it was a quote ascribed to Lenin, and it may be apocryphal, but I think it's true, and that is, you probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw. And that really is the Russian way of grand strategy and diplomacy, which is that they look for weakness, probe for weakness, and try to take advantage and exploit any signs of weakness. So I think you're right that paradoxically, to really get a resolution to the war, you probably have to show some steel. You probably have to be prepared to say no, and let the Russians recognize that there are limits to how far they can go. Now, I think the president's been hesitant to go the sanctions track in particular because he's worried about, number one, souring the negotiating climate, and number two, he doesn't think necessarily that this will change Putin's calculus fundamentally on the war. But in the end, if you really want a negotiated solution, I think that hitting the Russians, pushing sanctions forward, might actually engender some seriousness in Moscow. And then secondly, even if it doesn't fundamentally change how Putin thinks about the war, it weakens Russia. And the slow and steady weakening of the Russians, I think, is in the American interest. So we're probably at an impasse. I think the administration realizes it's at an impasse in its diplomatic initiative. They've moved from what they've kind of described as shuttle diplomacy, where they have Ambassador Witkoff going to Moscow and General Kellogg going to talk to the Ukrainians. And they've now kind of forced the two parties, the Russians and the Ukrainians, together directly and trying to step back themselves, the U.S., that is. And I think they're searching about and trying to figure out what the next step is. But Trump doesn't seem to have given up yet on the negotiating track. But, he's musing aloud now that it might not be working, and that Trump and Putin, in his words, might be tapping him along.
Well, this is the problem. Number one, I pick up the Wall Street Journal Thursday's Wall Street Journal, and the lead article is about moving defensive technology that stops drones, moving it away from the Ukraine and moving it to the Middle East. So the question becomes, why is the administration doing that? Is it because we don't have enough military resources to give to both Ukraine and to our allies in the Middle East against a potential attack by Iran? Is it because they're so annoyed at the government of Ukraine that they're trying to punish them, and this is some sort of retribution? And if we don't have enough to supply both arenas, doesn't that say something really terrible about our preparedness to meet the challenges that confront us? And by the way, one more thought, then I turn it back to you. Why has all the pressure seemed to have been on Zelensky and on Ukraine when the aggressor is Russia? Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I don't think that decision was meant to punish the Ukrainians. At least I didn't interpret it as such. I think it's probably a matter of resource scarcity and the basic problem that the Iran issue is coming to a boil, and the administration is preparing for contingencies should negotiations fail with the Iranians. But it does get at the larger point, which you just hinted at or even made explicitly, which is that our defense industrial base really has grown weak over the years. There are many choke points in it, and we're not really prepared for multiple contingencies anymore the way we once were. And so it's become very difficult in our defense industrial base to have enough interceptors for, say, a Guam war scenario, Patriot interceptors, and at the same time send them to Ukraine so that they can defend their cities. It's real homework that we have to do, and I think something we have to address. And in a way, a lot of the investments that have been made to help Ukraine, defense supplementals here at home, have gone to building up our defense production, because in war, what matters is to have production capacity more so even than stockpiles. And maybe just one quick digression on that. I recently read that in 1916, the French army fired its entire pre-war artillery stockpile in 1 month. In 1918, the German army in World War I, which had the largest pre-war stockpile, fired its entire artillery stockpile in 2.5 months. So what matters is not how many pieces of munition you have in warehouses, but how quickly you can build out your production if war eventually comes. And in a way, the Ukraine war, as awful as it is, has given us an opportunity to build out our production capacity if only we'll use it and seize it. And to date, we've done some of that, but we need to do more. As to the pressure, there's truth in that. Of course, we are fundamentally on the side of the Ukrainians, and so there are sanctions in place, and there are weapons that are flowing to Ukraine. And so in that sense, we have chosen sides. I mean, we are supplying ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, to the Ukrainians. We're not doing that for the Russians, of course. But there is a good argument to be made that now is the time, having tried this diplomatic track, having reached out a hand to the Russians and trying to get them to shut down the war, that the president's realizing maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't just follow his pecuniary interests. Maybe he's not just interested in a financial deal. Maybe there are things like culture and history and imperial thoughts that are driving him. And so we have to put in place a pressure campaign to try to get the Russians to move, or if not, to weaken them sufficiently to where Ukraine can get an enduring peace.
Eric, have you joined us, Eric?
I have joined you. I apologize for being late. Peter, it's great to hear you.
Hi, Eric.
So here I'm speaking to you from our nation's capital. So this recent drone strike deep inside Russia that the Ukrainians carried out, destroying significant parts of apparently the Russian Air Force. Can you speak to how meaningful that is, why it matters, and where do you think the consequences of that will be?
I think it's dramatically important for several reasons. For one, these are the air systems that the Russians have used to launch so-called standoff strikes, which Ukraine has struggled to intercept, and for which it has too few interceptors. And so by going to the airplanes themselves while they're still parked on the tarmac and taking them out, it significantly degrades Russia's ability to inflict terror on Ukrainian cities and to hit frontline positions with these large lumbering standoff systems, because these are airplanes that will fly far away from Ukraine but launch from there, and Ukraine hasn't had a great answer on intercepting those systems. Secondly, it's important because it boosts Ukrainian morale. It shows that they're very much so in the fight and that they can counterpunch. It also matters for the politics of the United States, quite frankly. I think it really weakens the arguments of those who say we should throw in the towel on Ukraine because they're destined to lose anyways. What's the point? What can we actually accomplish? And here, the Ukrainians are showing that through their own ingenuity and grit and creativity, they're able to launch really a masterful operation that has really inflicted serious pain on Russian military operations. So I think those are all hugely important elements of why this strike mattered a lot, and it probably weakens the arguments of those in Washington who will say we should cut off assistance, and it probably strengthens the hands of those who say we should continue supporting Ukraine.
Go ahead, Eric.
Just to pick up on the point about those in Washington who want to abandon Ukraine, is there anyone in particular or any group in particular that has the president's ear or is in the inner circle that you're aware of that is making that argument? And if they are, how effective they are being?
Oh, I think the argument isn't put as crudely or maybe as directly as I just made it to abandon Ukraine, or maybe the way you phrased it. But I think there are different sets of arguments that are being made, which I think are making their way to the president. One is that we have a major looming security crisis in the Indo-Pacific. Secretary Hegseth in Singapore just this week spoke about a potential imminent war in Asia. He's not saying it's going to take place necessarily, but war could be imminent, for example, over Taiwan. So in that scenario, if we're going to have a major military support system in place for Ukraine while at the same time having to fight against China over Taiwan, should we choose to do so, it really begins to strain our resources and our abilities and our quite frankly, our defense industrial base's ability to sustain two efforts like that. One, which we would be directly involved in, of course, as active combatants, but the other one still supporting Ukraine. And then there, I think, aside from those groups of advisors who think a lot about China and America's forward presence there in the Indo-Pacific in particular, there's others who I think just believe America should come home more, should pull up the bridges. We've been at war for a long time with what are arguably failed wars in Iraq and definitely in Afghanistan, and all of that I think has caused people to lose confidence in America's ability to project power. And once that, I think, basic fundamental tenet takes hold, it's basically an argument for this is worthless, this is hopeless, and America can't project power effectively. And I don't think it's any secret who has been making some of those arguments. There is almost sort of a new elite forming in parts of the Republican Party. Tulsi Gabbard is the DNI. She's relatively young. There are others who are next generation leaders who would probably nod along as I say America should come home more rather than try to project power abroad.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
This episode is brought to you by San Pellegrino. A meal isn't just about what's on your plate. It's about what you bring to the table. San Pellegrino believes the table is where the best of life happens. That's what makes gathering around it so rich and rewarding. And with their unique sparkling natural mineral water, San Pellegrino brings its best so you can bring yours.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Jesse.
Peter, thank you for your service to our country in the Bush administration, Bush 43. But I wanted to just, before I ask you my question on Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to just ask you about your role and the experience of assisting President Bush with his memoir, Decision Point. I think this would be interesting to our readers because they never to get within that room, that writer's room, peel back the curtain to see how that experience is, how that comes to be. The give and take between the president and yourself and others who may have assisted him in writing that outstanding memoir, which I own. Can you just touch upon that a little bit before I just ask you a quick question about Russia and Ukraine?
Sure. So the President Bush, George W. Bush, was a kind of ravenous consumer of biographies and just read a lot, period. And I think as you look through the presidential histories and autobiographies, he ultimately, of course, the gold standard is Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography, but he ultimately landed on a framework of rather than writing a memoir in the classical sense, I was born here in this state all the way up to the present moment. He instead decided to write his memoirs and around key decisions that he took in his life, both in his personal and public service life. And basically what he would do is every day he would write after he might be prompted by one of us, what was your 9/11 like? How do you think about education policy? What was your relationship with Tony Blair? Sort of offhand, almost questions like this. And then he would write on all of this. And then we worked to stitch it all together into kind of around these key decisions. And I spent a lot of time in the archives and reading decision memos and looking at notes that key aides took in their notebooks. And so I'm very proud to say if you go down to the presidential archives in Dallas for the George W. Bush administration, I am researcher number 1. I think I was the first one to sign into the archives.
Is that your name? Researcher number 1? Is that how you're identified?
Yeah, exactly.
That's great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, that's like the first chair, isn't it? An orchestra?
Well,
the first violin.
The disadvantage is that it wasn't very well organized yet, so it was pretty difficult to get stuff. But anyway.
Jesse, I have a question about Ukraine.
Yeah, to pick up on actually what Eric talked about in the drone strike. With everything that we've seen with Russia and its military force, has Russia, in these last 3 years in its battle with Ukraine, lost its luster as a superpower or its influence everywhere? Because this is a 3-year war going on 3 years. Most conventional wisdom, when they first occurred in March of 3 years ago, expected the Ukraine to be defeat would be swift. And during that course, Russia needed to rely on partners like China, North Korea, Iran for soldiers, for technology, for armaments and other technology. And this drone strike that seemed to have taken out their ability to fire into Ukraine from afar, as you described, how are world leaders and world military experts now looking at Russia and its military capabilities?
Well, I would neither exaggerate nor underestimate the Russians. On the one hand, they are suffering these enormous battlefield casualties, some 1,500 a day, and when they're really in high tempo operations, sometimes slightly even more than that. But they are learning along the way, and I think their willingness to stomach those sorts of losses is somewhat intimidating in and of itself. We lost thousands of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, but nowhere near the numbers that the Russians are suffering, even on a monthly basis. And yet it really caused, political tremors and earthquakes in American life and American politics. So for the Russians to do this, to push, makes one worry that if they did launch a major war with NATO and European nations were involved in the fighting, do we have the stomach, to beat that back? Secondly, I would say that one shouldn't misread the Ukrainians. They're not a NATO member state, but they are, by landmass, the largest country in Europe, and a pre-war population of 40 million ranks them up pretty high. They've also had a decent defense industrial base left over as a vestige and a legacy of the Cold War. So they had some capabilities at their own disposal. And I felt this in months and years leading up to the war, of all the Europeans who would come through Hudson Institute, and we regularly have delegations from across the continent, the Ukrainians really do have an esprit de corps and a sense of pride, and there's a nationalism there that ranks near the top. And so that mixture means that Ukraine actually proved to be a really formidable target that the Russians and that Vladimir Putin put in his crosshairs. And, it's sort of stunning given that it's the country he might know best of all of the European countries, that he so fundamentally misread how they would react to the war. He thought through a simple thunder run to Kyiv, he could get basically the government to crumble and the population to flip. And none of that, of course, proved to be true. Moreover, the Russians have basically now gone to a defense wartime economy. And so they are rapidly trying to re-equip and rebuild their armed forces or build in new directions. And they are probably learning lessons quicker than we are in the West, because it's very hard to learn at the same pace as somebody who's a combatant in combat. So you're right. I mean, there is a basic weakness there. I have no doubt if we ended up at war with Russia that the West would win. But there's something worrying there. I do think some of their defense customers around the world. I mean, the Russians don't export a lot. They export oil and gas. They export vodka, caviar, and then basically weapon systems. And I do think, given how badly they need their own defense production to service their own military, that there's an opportunity to pick off here or there some of their defense customers who might also be less than impressed by how Russian kit has performed in the war. So there are opportunities there, but Russia, I think, still is a pretty serious and significant opponent.
Peter, on behalf of Chairman Garcia, Eric Levine, and myself, we want to thank you for being on Let the Record Show. This has been a very compelling and interesting conversation. Your insights and your analysis are just absolutely wonderful. And I think this war is going to go on for a while. So on behalf of Jesse and Eric and myself, we're going to be bringing you back probably for a play-by-play, if that's acceptable to you.
I'd be delighted to do that. And thank you, gentlemen. The pleasure was really all mine.
Okay. This has been Let the Record Show. We've been delighted to have Peter Rough of the Hudson Institute, an expert on foreign policy and national security, with a real expertise on Europe, as our guest. On behalf of Jesse, Eric, and myself, God bless you, God bless your families, and of course, God bless America. Look forward to being with you again next week on Let the Record Show. Thank you for listening.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.